Welcome to episode 270 of Sports Geek. On this week's episode, I chat journalism, Twitter, and the appeal of grassroots sports with journalist Richard Hinds.
Welcome to Sports Geek, the podcast built for sports digital and sports business professionals. And now, here's your host who will be at the MCG on March 8th for ICC Women's World T20 Final, Sean Callanan.
Thanks, DJ Joel. Yes, my name is Sean Callanan, and you can and you will find me at the MCG on March 8th for the ICC Women's World T20 Final at the MCG, where they are trying to break a world record on International Women's Day. So it'll be interesting to see. Please check it out and see how they go. We're not sure yet, as I'm recording this, who is going to be playing, but we do know that Katy Perry will be there, and hopefully they're going to try to fill the MCG, which will be an amazing effort by the team from the T20 Organising Committee. As always, you can find me on all parts of the internet, whether it be via email, sean@sportsgeekhq.com, or via Twitter, at Sean Callanan, at SportsGeek, on most channels. And don't forget, you can send in your questions. If you've got a question from today's interview or from a previous podcast you've listened, or you want my opinion on something, or there's a trend you would like some analysis of, simply send me a question. Go to sportsgeekhq.com/questions and I'll answer them in the Q&A series that gets released on a Friday morning, Australian time, of course. So send in those questions via that method, or you can ask me in real life, and I might repurpose some of those questions. So you might see me at a Sports Biz Melbourne event, or maybe at a cricket match or a football match or a basketball match. Before we jump into today's chat with Richard Hinds, a long-time sports journalist, to talk about the latest trends and how the industry has changed from a journalist point of view, I just want to talk a little bit about our Patreon campaign and welcome a new startup supporter, Jeremy Bainon. And I hope I've said your name right, because I did have a friend in primary school that was Benyon, and I keep going to say that. But Jeremy Bainon from Boom Stats Analysis has come on board as a startup supporter. I really do appreciate the support, Jeremy. You can check out Boom Stats Analysis. It is a affordable cloud-based responsible data gathering platform which enables players, coaches, and clubs to evaluate their performance based on in-match results with no bias. So go to Boom Stats Analysis and check it out. If you go to you can go to boomstatsanalysis.com. You will find all things Boom Stats Analysis, and it's just a way and analytics for everyone. So if you want to be like Jeremy and support the podcast and the content that we're doing across the sports business space, you can do so at our Patreon campaign, sportsgeekhq.com/Patreon. You can do it for as little as $4 a month, or if you're a startup supporter, if you're a startup that is looking to reach the sports biz audience, please sign up, as Jeremy has done. Or if you're a sports technology brand or someone that wants to reach this sports geek audience, you can do so as a silver or gold supporter. Check it all out, sportsgeekhq.com/Patreon. Thanks again, Jeremy. You will find links to all the people who are supporting the podcast in the show notes and in the regular email Sports Geek News. So if you're looking at those logos down the bottom and you're wondering what they are, you can click on them and find out more about some of the businesses that do support our efforts in the podcasting and newsletter space. Now, let's get into my chat with Richard Hinds. He's a long-time sports journalist based in Melbourne that covers a multitude of sports as a columnist and has worked at a few different media outlets. And we talk about all things media and journalism and how it's changed over the years. Here's my chat with Richard Hinds. I'm here on a very wet day here in Fitzroy, but I'm joined by Richard Hinds, sports journalist here in Melbourne. Welcome to the podcast.
Nice to be with you, Sean. Thanks for having me on the pod.
No worries. Well, first of all, I always ask people at the start of the interview, how did you get your start in the world of sport and sports journalism in particular?
Well, bit of a long story because I started my cadetship at the old Afternoon Herald straight out of high school in 1984, and I was always on a path to cover politics. So first of all, I did a lot of police reporting, and then I went to state parliament, did industrial relations. And on the same day, I was offered a spot up in Canberra, which had always been my dream. But just coincidentally, a really good sports editor called Jeff Slattery had joined the Herald, and some friends had worked for him. And I thought, you know what, I'll do that for a year before I get into the other side of what I wanted to do. About 30 years later, I'm still doing sport. It's an addictive profession. Yeah. It's the old cliche, but you're paid to go to the footy, you're paid to cover the Olympics, you're paid to be at Augusta and Wimbledon, and it was an addictive path for me, and I've loved every minute of it. Very
much a sliding doors moment.
Yeah, very much so. You know, like I said, I was always on that path. I was really interested in politics and still am. But I just got on this path, and it allowed me, I guess, sport at the time was one of the areas where you could have a voice. So I started writing, colour pieces and profiles, and eventually became a columnist. So I was able to voice an opinion and write more colourfully. My friends who went up to Canberra were spending cold mornings sticking recorders under the noses of politicians at 6 o'clock in the morning, and that didn't appeal at the time.
Yeah. And so, I caught up with Simon Matthews, who was in the media manager role at Essendon and now at Richmond, and we discussed a little bit about how that has changed over time. How has it changed from your side of the fence, being the journalist and seeing footy clubs rise up and be their own media departments and their own media channels? How's it been from your side?
Yeah, I'm often asked this if I speak to students and so forth, and I guess the two areas are access and platforms. And when I talk about access, I always talk about how when I first started, my first assignment was to go down and cover Melbourne Football Club, who were on the rise then in the late 80s under John Northey. And my typical day of covering football then was evening training because all the players had come from work, and you'd stand on the boundary and talk to the team manager, talk to the doctor, Peter Bruckner, who's become quite a celebrity himself, Peter, in later life. You'd get all the news of what was happening. Then the coach would come off. You'd have a yarn to him. You'd say good day to the few players you knew. Then you'd go into the sheds and talk to the players and come out with a story. Yep. Whereas now, 30 more years later, if the kids covering it now go down to training and they get one player selected randomly who might not even be part of the story of the day, standing in front of a sponsor board, they're lucky to have the numbers of a coach or players or whatever, So access has changed tremendously, and I understand the reasons for that. The amount of media covering has grown enormously, the demands, the wishes of clubs to hive off their own media for their own commercial areas. That's changed a lot, but I would find it difficult now. And, if I had to make that Canberra sport choice, knowing what I do about access to athletes now, I might have gone the other way. And then when I talk about platforms, that's obviously the, online initially and then social media and the demands to interact in that space. I was really fortunate early in my career. I covered, a lot of Olympics, and I took the golf and tennis rounds for a while. So I'd be at Wimbledon and Augusta, and you could go watch the sports, go and talk to people, sit down and write your one or two stories for the day. Yeah. It then became a 24-hour cycle. Everything was online. Everything had to be first. And so we have that question in the media now, are you better off being first or being right? Yeah. And getting that balance right. It sounds obvious. Of course you need to be right first, but the pressures, again, on young journalists to have that story first, to have that exclusive, they're enormous. So again, I've stepped away from that everyday kind of reporting, and I don't miss that particular pressure. Occasionally I might watch Wimbledon or watch, a big event and whimsically sort of wish to be there, but I certainly don't wish to have that 24-hour pressure that they work under now.
Well, that's the thing. You've got so many players. Like when you started, there was 2 to 3 newspapers and 2 or 3 TV channels, and that's where you had to go to get a job. And now digital has become limitless, but has also become, like you said, relentless in the demand for content. Like the appetite for content hasn't subsided. We haven't had sports fans say, no, we're full. Like we don't need any more content. And so it does make it tough to, one, cut through that noise from a journalism point of view. Yeah,
and I don't in any way, when I talk about the access the journalists have and the pressure they have, I don't in any way belittle the work they're doing now. In some ways, I think they're vastly superior in terms of, their go-getterism. And, I was a contemporary of Eddie Maguire, and he and Steve Quartermain at the time were the two young TV news reporters, and they changed the dynamic of how it was done. You know, it used to be, I remember going, when I was at RMIT, I did an attachment with Channel 7, and I went in with, I think it was Sandy Roberts or the others, and Peter Landy and the guys of the time. They would go in and pick up the paper, maybe bring up someone, go and do a 90-second interview, come back, and that was their day's work done. Whereas Eddie and Quarters and then guys like Craig Hutchinson after them, they pioneered news breaking on TV, and that changed everything for us in newspapers because, again, we were losing that advantage we'd have. We'd always be, they would follow us, and we'd find that we were having to follow them at times. We'd be looking at the 6 o'clock news. So that changed the dynamic. And then, of course, that's gone on to other platforms, online, social media, and that's accelerated that news cycle. Again, you might ask, well, the quality of that, where is that first versus right dynamic? Where is the depth of the reporting in that? But I still think, it's a particular skill in itself, and I really admire those who do it well. Yeah,
and I think there does seem to be a pullback, and there definitely seems to be offerings in market now where people still want that depth, because you can only be skimming the surface on, reading a tweet and liking something and seeing something come through, and you want to know more about the player and the story behind the player, and have true storytellers tell those stories. And so we're seeing things like Netflix doing long things, ESPN 30 for 30, what The Athletic's doing, and what Bill Simmons is trying to do with longer form content. Everyone keeps saying, it's coming back, but there's a little case, it never went away. It's just the noise makes it a bit tougher to sometimes find those pieces. Yeah, look, I couldn't agree more. I mean, my love of sports writing grew out of having my HSC English lit teacher was an American, and his father would send him copies of Sports Illustrated and the Sporting News and books from America, and he'd pass them on to me when he was finished. And so I got that real sense of that depth of writing. And then, when I lived in England for a while, the great English writers and so forth. And I think we've had that, and that's been nurtured here. I guess the worry is, we look at things like Grantland, which begat the TV stuff. For me, the written word, who pays for it, is obviously the issue. And we saw what happened with Grantland, being from
lost. And then the Ringer emerged and whatever. But there's still that, does the pay model suit the written word? Whereas visually, I think we've never been better serviced at all. And we look at the AFL now, looking at through Amazon, there's a controversy about who will do it, but it is being done. And that sort of depth of research and documentary is there.
But I think, that's also the disruption to the whole media space. So like you said before, you would write a piece, whether it's a reporting on something and that's how you would get it, or it would be a longer opinion piece, and you would take the time and you would open up the paper and you would read it. And those models have been disrupted. So we're seeing News and Fairfax seeing their models change, seeing their owners change, which, is very different in this market with multiple owners. Like, they're still figuring out where all of that content goes and who pays, like the ad model. Is it subscriber? Is it a combination of both? You're a cog in that machine. You're a cog in that machine. You're a journalist, but, now you're probably termed a content producer to the grist to that mill. How do you be a part of that machine and make it, keep pursuing what you want to pursue?
I'm probably lucky in that I had a brief aborted kind of period with News Corp where I kind of went into that more content producer space.
Yep.
It probably didn't work out for me the way I wanted. I was there for about 3 or 4 years, producing columns for the Daily Telegraph, and there was some plans to do some other stuff for Fox Sports, but I wasn't probably the right peg in that hole, which was fine. And that's, I guess, what we've seen is the development of that multi-skilled, multi-platformed journo, and some transition to it better than others. I do a little bit of stuff on Offsiders, but Offsiders lends itself to the scruffy journo, I think, in a way. I think it's kind of a counterintuitive show where you don't have to be a really good presenter because your credibility comes from your contacts, your experience, your knowledge, and the conversation, where there is still a thing with certainly with TV where you need that sheen, that production, and I wouldn't certainly consider myself in that ilk. So the younger ones coming through, though, they develop these skills earlier, and obviously part of I've been to a few journalists journalism schools to do lectures and so forth, and you could see they pitch themselves in that way, and they also see themselves jumping the fence pretty quickly to communications, which raises other concerns in a way because that's become quite blurred.
Yeah, I mean that was sort of the case as AFL starts producing its own media, cricket starts producing its own media, and everyone starts being their own media shops. It's like, well, who's gonna hold them accountable? One of the things that journalists do is ask the big questions and ask the thorny questions. But if you're working for the company that you're reporting on, it's a really tough balance.
Yeah, I know. And this is going back a few years. This isn't with the present model, but I know early days at the AFL, talking to some friends who were working there for the AFL media, it was a really interesting dynamic where they tried to position themselves as being an independent media company, which is obviously quite absurd because they're paid for and working for the AFL. And so the way they pitched themselves independently was to sort of go pretty hard at the clubs. They'd do stories that were kind of newspaper worthy, whether, news stories, exposés or whatever, but without touching the executive of the AFL who are signing the checks. And this ended up getting the club's noses out of joint because they're going, hang on, this is our own competition is kind of attacking us here. And so they had to rein that back in. And I know it's an awkward fit. And again, I don't want to be seen to be attacking the people who work there because there's some really excellent, writers and newsbreakers and stuff providing content for the AFL site now. And, I think things like their pure footy thing, like their draft analysis and things like that are first rate. But there's always that sensitivity about, so if the AFL stuffs up at executive level, are they going to go as hard on that as they would elsewhere? Of course they're not. So it's buyer beware. Yeah,
and that club thing of club land versus HQ, which is not an AFL thing. It's every league club dynamic. They're all trying to build off these models. The models started with Major League Baseball and the NBA, building out these media monoliths that are starting to report, and so that's the model that they're following. But it does. It's like the church and state. You can't separate it. Like they're still going to be part of the competition, and there's still going to be arguments about their schedule and their draw, as well as the media piece. And I think the access piece is tough because, like you said, they're trying to build out this media model, and it's like, well, who are they playing favours for? And I think the access piece is probably going to come with the money piece. Like we're seeing now, Amazon is going to pay the money to be able to have the access to do the documentaries. How is that going to change, I guess, the media that we consume if the only people that get access are the people that hand over the cash?
Well, it changes everything, of course, because you're beholden to, the relationship. So it's the classic, official media partner versus independent media operator. And it's always interesting seeing that through a journalist's eye. But what I wonder is, I often wonder, well, does just, the average reader make that leap as well? Some people are more media savvy than others. They take that leap. But, it is a propaganda exercise in the most extreme examples. And then again, it's funny, I say this, it might be 1% of the occasions. Like I say, just to make an example, Gillan McLaughlin stuffs up and gets a soft serve on AFL.com as he would probably rightfully expect to do, but is getting attacked elsewhere. Do people delineate that, if their only news is they get the pop-up from the AFL app, and that's their only story, do they understand that the AFL version is going to be a lot softer than the mainstream media versions? I'm not sure.
And the thing is, the mainstream medias will still have relationships as well, and they've still got to worry about their commercial interests on what the next rights deal looks like, or who they might offend and how that might affect what they do in their next relationship.
Oh, and it's always been the way. I mean, look, our greatest compromise going back to earlier days when you had those closer relationships with people, when you were actually literally walking into the change rooms at training and talking to 10 players that you knew personally, was how much does your personal relationship then affect the way you write about them? You had to be, took a certain courage to write something pretty critical about a club and then walk in front of them. I've got one story actually I really remember from, I think it was just the eve of the 1988 grand final. I had a really good relationship with Melbourne's coach, John Northey.
Yep.
And I wrote a quote, and they I'd covered Melbourne for the past 2 years, and they sent me to Hawthorn, and they sent the Hawthorn reporter to Melbourne just to write.
Yeah.
And I wrote a piece saying how Hawthorn's training, just how brutal and attacking it was, and they didn't use training bags and whatever. The next day I walked into the Melbourne offices to get something. I was on the eve of the grand final. And John Northey came up from behind and grabbed me and threw me to the floor and said, "Is that brutal enough? Am I attacking? Do I need a tackling bag?" And he'd taken it that personally. And as he was half joking, half not. But you had that very eyeball relationship all the time. So the compromise would come there. It wasn't a commercial compromise. It was a personal compromise. So, it's always been there in media.
And I guess the thing now from an online point of view is you're not having those personal backwards and forwards. So you don't know why coach so-and-so is not returning your calls or whatever, because it might be for one sentence or one phrase, one turn of phrase in an article, because you're not getting that access. You're not having that banter backwards and forwards that you might have had back in the day.
Yeah, I think what I see with the younger journalists, and this is my fear, and I kind of, I try to, I'm sounding like the grizzled old man, but I try to reach out to younger journalists if I see something that I think I could advise them on, and I see a lack of empathy. And I think that comes from disconnection. They don't have that eyeball relationship. They don't have that feedback all the time. So they go a bit harder, and they can be really brutal about things online or on their Twitter accounts, or say things very quite cutting that you wouldn't normally say, I think, if you were going to have that, see them the next day. And I think they go over the top. So I think that virtual relationship has created a lack of empathy, and then that can stem towards players and coaches being, criticised. It could, if you take it to the vast extreme, mental health things coming both ways. It comes over the fence the other way as well. So I think, that's one thing that's been lost. And
it's sort of touching on that online space. You're an active and avid user of Twitter, RD Hinds, if you want to follow Richard. Were you always? Like when it first came out, I remember talking to a bunch of journalists early on about it. What was your first take, and how did you get into Twitter? No,
I was a classic eye roller. I remember a colleague of mine, Emma Quayle, who's she was a terrific draft writer, and she's now working in
Giants.
Recruiting at the Giants, and a fantastic journo, and now really good at what she does there. But she was into it, and we were talking about it at the tennis, and I'm like, I will never get into that. And then she's like, no, try it. And 1 becomes 100 pretty quickly, because you get that interaction that you don't get. And it's interesting for journalists, because there is the intoxication of that instant response. And of course, it's snowballed a lot over the years. So I've gone through various phases over the maybe 10 years I've used it, where I've gone into heavy interaction with people, but then that can snowball into you start getting paranoid and getting too top. And then I've gone into kind of just putting columns up for a while, and just
being in publisher mode,
no responses. And then I have, I've got some comedy stuff going on. I'm a cricket nut and a really bad opening batsman. So I started a hashtag called Real Openers, which is about slow batting and an appreciation of that. And I think people like that because it's just gentle and warm about cricket. So I have various iterations, but I fall in and out of love with it. I guess my latest iteration is I interact, but I'm less. I try to take away anything with two meanings, because I find that people just, even if you respond just thoughtfully or almost agree with them, they instantly think by responding you're in a fight with them.
Yeah, there's a bit of that outrage culture that is online. It's like, I'm here for a fight. Hang on, you're not fighting with me. What's going on?
I often now use the word respectfully. I say, look, I respectfully disagree, and I hope that just makes them say, look, I'm just respectfully putting a counter opinion. I'm not punching you in the face and breaking my bottle and holding it at your throat. I'm just saying, look, from what I understand,
but it is different. But it is challenging. Like like I remember, I think I was talking to Finn Bradshaw, who's working with all the news guys early on, and I said, hey, happy to talk to all the journalists and help them understand what the platform is. It's a great way to connect with the common man, the common woman, and sort of get a feel for what they're saying. And like, no. And then, then all of them eventually got on, and you can use it just as a bullpit. All right. Mm-hmm. Hey, this is me. I'm going to say my stuff and I'm going to block everybody and not listen to everybody, which is one way of doing it. And then there's others that sort of get a bit into the banter, but you can get stuck in the weeds really quickly.
Yeah. You can sink very quickly. Oh, look, I can't tell you the number of times that I've got into something and just realised, I'm way too deep into this. And it's usually well-meaning. You start off with it might be a joke that can be taken two ways, or a statement that you're just contradicting someone based on fact. And as a journalist, it's an interesting thing. It just as a bit of an aside about social media. It's given public voice to everyone's opinion. And the most frustrating thing you find as a journalist is you might literally have been with the first source on a story. I'll give you I got to know Ange Postecoglou quite well through Offsiders, and have the odd coffee with him and so forth.
Former
and
Socceroos coach.
Yeah. So I had really first-hand knowledge of some stuff going on, and occasionally you'd see things and you go, actually, no, it's this. And people are like, no, it's this. And it's so frustrating. And then you have to pull yourself back and go, well, look, there's no way without betraying a confidence or without that I can tell you, you know this. But it's kind of a frustrating media because it's empowered people and to believe that their opinion is as strong as your fact.
Yeah.
But sometimes you can't really demonstrate why you have that fact. And that's journalism. And it's why I still write columns, because I still am able to ring people up. You know, I've still got enough CEOs and coaches and players in my phone that I can validate what I'm writing. But the empowerment of the opinion has probably been one of the great things or not so great things of social media.
But it has been like the challenge, and I think it is for young journalists. And I'm a big NBA fan, and Adrian Wojnarowski, Wojbomb, like he pretty much just turns the internet when a NBA trade's about to happen, and he makes a mockery of the draft. Like he announces the draft picks before the commissioner walks up there, to a point where the ESPN had to say stop doing it.
Yeah.
And he breaks so much like content on Twitter, he doesn't actually bring the traffic back to the website, which is, again, if you're writing articles and writing opinion pieces, you don't want to have this conversation on this platform over here. You're being paid to drive eyeballs and viewership and dwell time on websites. So you sort of see young journalists or a bunch of journalists are sort of going, well, I'm going to make a name for myself and know this is where the breaking news is happening. But you've also got to realise that your end goal should be your column or engaging with your piece. But I do think it gives you an opportunity to expand your personal brand, right?
Yeah,
so people can.
It certainly does. But on the case like the Woj bombs, I think that's just a great example of just purely in my craft. And I hived off into feature writing and opinion and whatever. News is God, and I've always deferred in my office. I was never a great news breaker by any means. I had periods covering teams and stuff where you'd get stories and whatever, but I was more of a colour writer and an opinion writer. News is God in our industry, and it still is. In those, if that just pure, this is going to happen. With whether AFL, a coach sacking story or all the great, a player signing, whatever. They're our God. So it's actually reassuring in a way that they are still the, something pure like that goes off, and that's the big talking point. Because I like I said, I deferred to the, I worked with people in AFL, like Mike Sheehan and Caroline Wilson, and then later Jake Nile, and these people who are just so good at being first. And I love the fact that still, that purity of news is still cutting through. Yeah,
and it's still like, even though you have, the leaks or the people saying that they know stuff, like you can still have those big stories broken by, those kind of journalists, and that's how you find out about them. Yes, I talk about Twitter as a distribution platform. Like, it's where you might find out about it, but you're still going to end up going back to the original source, who wrote it, what is more of the depth, because you've got to go past the headline at some point.
Yeah, absolutely.
One of the pieces that caused me to reach out to you was a piece you wrote around stadium size and crowds. And, I shared it on my LinkedIn to say, really interesting piece sort of coming off the back of cricket season and, seeing small crowds in big stadiums and that kind of piece. What were your thoughts? Where did you start scratching that itch and for that type of story and what are your thoughts on that space?
Yeah, well, look, it's funny, my stadium interest probably goes back to my days. I moved up to Sydney to work for the Sydney Morning Herald before the 2000 Olympics.
Yep.
And being from Melbourne, where we just take for granted good stadia, I think the Docklands in its various name incarnations was being built or being built. The MCG has been renovated, and Sydney were building stadiums around the Olympics. But I covered the Swans and a bit of other, bit of rugby league and whatever out there. And it just struck me the difference between their stadia, so forth, and that sparked a debate that still goes on to this day, 20 years later. And I was very much a proponent of why aren't they providing stadiums that would attract bigger crowds. They'd already probably, the AFL had, as usual, kind of interfered in their model by getting involved with the Olympic Stadium, which meant that it had to be an oval configuration, which basically ruined it, in my opinion, for Union League and football. The three challenging codes in the city. But it's such a complicated market, Sydney, with the crowd sizes in different games, the geographical differences, the kind of self-defeating idea that rugby league is a great TV game, so just stay home and watch it at 4 o'clock, delayed on a Sunday. So for a long time. So I guess I got really passionately involved and did a lot of research into stadiums, talked to a lot of people up there around it. So it's been an ongoing thing of mine. The stadium model thing, I guess, is really interesting. I think to kind of paraphrase what I wrote in the column, I think it's interesting that the AFL, and good on them, they've just been so good at lobbying government money. Other codes would say hijacking the stadium agenda. They would say driving it. That they've built stadiums on a model that suits them, but their crowds are wildly disproportionate to most models elsewhere, including even the Premier League. I think the usual survey is I think German soccer, German football is the one that they vie with for biggest average crowds, and college football in America, which is kind of a religion, although even that's coming back, and I think they're building smaller stadiums. So we have, of course, we're almost stuck with these
Coliseums, that are big, and the Australian market is a strange one. Like, I talk to people in the US around the stadiums that are being built there, and they are very much being built, for the market. So if you look at LAFC Stadium, Bank of California Stadium, like it's in the it's close to downtown LA. And it seats, I think, 14 or 15,000. Might be 17. Apologies, Colin, if I've got it wrong. But then you fill it and you get all the atmosphere. Whereas, and a lot of the stadiums in the US are privately funded, either by the teams or the owners. And here we've always got it's government funding, like you said. You have to lobby government to get it, and so then the stadium always gets upgraded to we need it for this big event. Which so it's 5 key events a year. But that means there's 55 or 60 or 100 dates that it's not at capacity. Yeah,
and we have a share model, obviously. So we've got sports with disparate crowds, vastly different averages sharing the same stadiums. And we don't have a population big enough to support more. Yep. So it's a really, really complex area. I just see, I did a bit of research, and you can just see though that the models around the world are going smaller. It's interesting, even some of those colleges that have rebuilt, or baseball particularly. I think the last 5 new baseball stadiums were smaller than the ones.
I think the only one would have been Yankees, when they pretty much did a carbon copy of Yankee Stadium.
Yeah, but I think it was slightly smaller than the original because of some of the boxes and so forth.
And so and most of them are seeing more of an event experience. And it's all about the fan experience. So they're like, we don't need all those seats there. Let's make it a deck, and it's a bar, and you can stand there, and there's football or baseball or soccer or basketball happening in the background, and it's an experience. And so I think that's where it's going to be interesting to see what the AFL does now that it owns Marvel Stadium, what it's going to look like in its next, incarnation. And it's, pretty amazing that they own the stadium, and they're probably going to get the government to chip in for whatever the redevelopment is, because that's what they're good at doing.
They're masters of it.
But it is, it makes sense that stadiums go smaller because crowds are falling globally. Yeah. Like, people aren't going to as much because we're spoiled for choice of so many different products available.
Yeah, and it's interesting, the AFL have even, I know, privately considered building a smaller boutique stadium, whether, there was some support for upgrading the old Princes Park, or I think there was some area in North Melbourne around the railway yards around there, that
Eddie Maguire was floating, another one near MCG and Punt Road Oval, Eddie's always going to be involved in something.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's interesting that even the AFL, who are counter to the argument, I think the sport that suffers the most for this is football in Australia. I kind of feel for them, because they not only play in outsized stadiums that don't lend themselves to the atmosphere, which is such a great part of the A-League. And I think people forget the early years of the A-League a little bit now, that it's in a bit of a trough, just some of the great atmospheres it created and how people were going along just to hear the crowd, you know, and it's a benefit. But they also get secondhand surfaces and so forth. They are, in my opinion, slightly a victim of their own poor government lobbying in that they put too many eggs in the Lowy basket. And when Lowy went down the World Cup bid road and that failed spectacularly and now he's out of the game, they lost all their government credits, whereas the AFL have been spectacularly good at lobbying. I used to, again, living in Sydney, I used to talk to NRL officials and FFA officials a little bit, and they say, how does it bloody happen? AFL, yeah. Bloody, and I said, well, okay, who have you got camped on a stretcher bed outside the Treasurer's office, the Sports Minister's office, the Prime Minister's office? You know, who's your local government expert getting funding at that level, your state level? The AFL did a tremendous job. And whether you want to say, well, that's, you know, they blindsided the other sports or they hijacked the agenda, however you want to put it, they did the hard yards and other sports played catch up. So that's how they drove the stadium agenda.
Yeah, and it's going to be interesting to see how it develops. I mean, the stadiums are what they are. They're not, you know, whether a new stadium pops up. I mean, it will be interesting to see how the guys at Western United build that smaller stadium for Western United. Yeah. You know, it's tough for them, you know, being in multiple homes at the minute, but once they do, you know, get that stadium up and running, it is in that model of, you know, LAFC smaller style and provide that atmosphere. But they've got a lot of road ahead of them on that.
Yeah, home stadiums are such a part of club identity. And again, I guess we throw, you know, probably a bit of an Anglo bias on my part, and I lived in London for a while, but I just loved when I lived there not only going to watch games, but going to these little, you know, I'm a QPR supporter in Loftus Road, I think it was 24,000, then you go to the Den at Millwall, and it was a different experience at every game. And again, I guess it gets back to football particularly is deprived of that sort of gut level, you know, root and branch kind of connection that those stadiums provide in Australia.
Yep. A lot of the focus in the media and a lot of the focus for your work previously has been looking at the top level of sport. But one of the things I think Australia does really well and is actually getting people playing sport, and had, you know, recent guests talking about that. You started dabbling in and sort of looking at grassroots sport recently. Why has that become a bit of a focus for you?
Like a lot of parents, I guess. I had an older boy, he's now 21. I played cricket with him for a couple of seasons down on the peninsula, and now I've got a boy who's 13, and I actually started a father-son or parent-child team this year. So some girls coming through. And I've just got involved in my local club. I'm vice president of Edinburgh Cricket Club. And so through that, what I saw was I went down to our club and we're in a growth area here. It's been gentrified. People have come back in. There's been an enormous boom. At one stage, I think we had 150 Milo, now Woolworths Blast kids, 7 under 10 teams, 7 under 12 teams, 5 under 4. We had just a massive, I think we're the second biggest community club in Australia or Victoria at least. Yep. What I saw, though, was this massive drop-off at the 12 to 13 age group, and it frustrated me because people saw it as an inevitability. It'd be like, oh, you know, they've got school, they've got homework, other sports.
Yeah, there's more extracurricular
esports, which
stuff.
is a passion of yours.
Yeah,
and
but there's
computers.
more extracurricular stuff at high school.
Whatever.
You know, the homework load and all of that kind of stuff.
And so I just thought, no, it doesn't have to be as inevitable. Some course, not every kid is a cricketer and wants to be. So I started a program myself, which is called Cricketer for Life, which I've done some work with, and I'm driving through at the moment. It's about keeping kids playing the game, and there's various aspects to it. And it's still a bit under wraps at the moment, but it's, you know, been successful so far. And it's just a pure retention program, and I don't think enough work is being put into that level. Sports drive really hard at entry level, early age, but not enough in keeping. And that there's, I guess, two levels to that. There's getting the clubs to do the hard work, and there's so much knowledge at grassroots. So part of my program is getting clubs together, and rather than telling them, you know, we have a broad framework for them to work with, but it's also hearing their stories, because these people work with clubs. There's so much knowledge that comes out of clubs. I've learned working with other clubs, learned so much myself that I wouldn't learn from even the top levels of the game. The next level of that is maintaining our clubs' participation culture, and I'm really passionate on this. I think I'd hate to see us go down the American road where there's just steep cliffs, so you stop playing football after high school, if you don't make it to college, just stop playing after college if you don't make it to.
And that's something that's uniquely Australian, that club network and that volunteer run.
Yeah.
Multiple leagues in multiple sports. It's a challenge to keep people playing.
Yeah.
But it's still, it is relatively uniquely Australian.
Yeah, and I think cricket gets it. I mean, I've had a bit to do with Belinda Clark, who's the head of community cricket at Cricket Australia, and she's passionately, her and her team are passionately engaged in doing just that. I think the board has changed a bit. I think it went down a very corporate road for a while, and probably there weren't enough people invested in the game. I think that's headed back the other way, and I think they understand. There was a statistic, I think it might have been the AFL who came up with it, that people who play the game up to, I think it was 18 or 20, are 7 times more likely to be consumers, to buy merchandise, to go to games, to be connected. Yeah, so if you keep people playing, not only are you milking the health benefits and that sort of aspect, you're getting the commercial benefit as well. So that's a sell for the top level, and it's a really good reason they should be passionately connected with their grassroots.
Yeah. And that's pretty much a conversation I had with Dino Dipiamendico around, the work that they've done in Auskick, and, talking to Luke Bold around what they're doing is exactly that. Like 80, again, I can't remember the stuff, but it is like a high percentage of the commercial revenue, the ticket buyers and membership people, the people who are turning up in attendance, are people that play the game to a certain level, right?
Yeah.
And so, if they drop off at 6, 7, 8 or 12, 13, 14, then you might not get them.
Yeah.
So back to our question of how do we fill these stadiums? Yes, you can be doing all these bells and whistles and fireworks and hand out trinkets to get people in, which is a bit of, fan engagement trickery. But it's like if you actually embed a love of the sport and why you're doing it, then they're more likely to lock in and go, oh, that's what I do.
And they lock into other aspects. So it's interesting. The cliche is, kids are only interested in BBL. And of course, that's a massive reason why we get so many entry-level, early-age junior kids. They come along, they've seen the BBL all summer, they want to play. But it's interesting. So I coached under 12s and, my kids playing under 14 now. Once they get up to that level and they keep playing, they suddenly become interested in Test cricket, because to watch Test cricket, there's a playing element. To appreciate it, if you've played, you understand why it's so hard to play that bowling or whatever. And so these kids suddenly get more and more interested in Test cricket. So for the future of all forms of the game, it's important. The retention piece particularly is really important, I think, not just the participation piece.
And from a journalism point of view, from a column point of view, have you been getting good feedback in talking more about that grassroots piece from an Australian point of view?
Yeah, absolutely, because people are invested. They have their own stories and their own, their parents playing. It's really interesting. The girls' sports space now is enormous, and we're right in the heart of it in my area here in Fitzroy. We have 4 junior girls teams, and we're hoping to get 2 women's teams. We've got 1 women's team at the moment. The Auskick and junior girls program at Fitzroy Footy Club's enormous. So that's that's a really hot area of conversation, how we, again, accommodate these people, I think that was, you talk about the recent Sports Rorts affair.
Yeah.
That was really interesting. So tapping into that, the passion of people around that, because they're at the heart of that. They're invested in getting these kids playing, creating opportunities for them, building their clubs. And so how that was, that played out, it was really interesting to see the passion that evoked, and it defied any party political lines. These were just people who've put a lot of hard work into trying to get their funds, get their clubs going. And whether or not they were right or wrong in terms of whether they'd been ripped off themselves, I think that really struck a nerve with people and showed how invested and passionate people are about community sport.
Yeah, and I think it is that community aspect. I think, our state, New South Wales, has just gone through some devastating bushfires and, devastating communities. And I think it will be community clubs, it will be the local footy club, the local cricket club that will help, rebuild and reconnect that community. Like that they will be focused on how do we get the sheds back operational, how do we make sure the oval's right to play for and it will bring the community together and become that backbone of, especially country regions. But I think, and I think in the city, we are missing that community.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. It's funny, I grew up in a little town called Warwicknabeal out in the Wimmera. I did all my primary school there, and I went back there, hadn't been back for years, and we drove into town on a Saturday afternoon, and I thought, oh my God, the whole town's abandoned and whatever. And then we drove down to Anzac Park where the game was, and the whole town was there, still just as it was, 40 years ago when I was a kid.
And,
kids around, and it was just literally
the
the town was dead because the footy was being played, and it's where people meet. It's where people associate, form plans, and build communities. You're absolutely right. And one of the marvellous things about living in this area is how that's organically occurred over my time here, where these clubs, which were the Brunswick Street, the local oval, was virtually abandoned by, Fitzroy Footy Club left in 66, and then Fitzroy Cricket Club went out to Doncaster in 86. So we had these beautiful facilities, but they've been regenerated now by people. It's just people getting together and forming friendships, and it's a terrific community to live in with a real soul. And sports played a very large part in that.
And that's the challenge for, the high-level sports executives to go, it's not a quick fix, right? But you have to invest in this piece. We're seeing many sports, seeing the benefits of investing in women's sport, and, the amount of girls that are now playing footy and cricket because the WBBL and the AFLW are getting more exposure, but it's like they're now starting to realise, well, it does start with grassroots.
Yeah, and the reality of life is it's, the motivation's going to be what's in it for me, as we saw, it's the votes and so forth, or whether it's the commercial opportunities for leagues. The AFLW pay, there was a dispute last year, but now there's kind of been a concern about the men might have to take a cut for the AFLW women to get more. But then if you look at who's driving the greatest growth in participation growth now, potentially retention growth, and then overall growth, if the young girls playing become lifetime consumers of football, that's in the women's space, and it's largely because of the women's league. So it's justifiable on those grounds, in my opinion.
And it is up to the AFL to appropriately commercialise that entity, which they are starting to do, but the first year is like, oh, you guys have got the coverage, you guys can have the AFL women. It's like, well, it is as of value to broadcasters and to brands that are coming into the space. So it's just a matter of, I guess, commercialising the way they've done the AFL, which they've done a really good job of.
It was a kind of counterintuitive debut, though. I think as worthy as the idea was, and good on Gil McLaughlin for driving it, I think there was a certain element of them doing it as a kind of a bit of a bulwark against participation in junior girls soccer and other areas. I'm not sure if they had any idea of the pent-up demand for the game itself. I think whether they would admit it or, they were like, we're going to do this. And they were completely surprised, I guess, by, you're right, the pent-up demand and the passion around it, and the fact that there's a whole fan segment that has not engaged with the AFL because they've been largely ignored. For over 100 years, and now they're like, oh, this is ours, we're now being accepted. And they, probably underestimated, I guess, the fervour by, that is received. And the passion you talk about is interesting because it's almost like it's a movement in a way. It's different to men's in that it's a sport. We watch the sport, go to the game, we've, played it and whatever, but there's a movement that takes it into all these other different areas around women's rights and so forth that need to be addressed and looked after. I think it was interesting that they didn't have the transgender piece in place before starting the competition, which they ran into some problems with that and so forth. So I'm not sure they've been totally prepared for just the groundswell and the momentum it's created. But it's been from an observer's point of view, it's been really interesting and great to watch.
And I think it's probably been the best mix of what we've been talking about before, about that community aspect and professionalism. Right, because it has that very much that community feel, and what you were talking about before of going up to the side and talking to one of the players and talking to you've got that access because they're all really welcoming of every piece of coverage, but also reaching out to all the fans. So you're getting really strong connection. Whereas things like Twitter and people having their pot shots at players like AFL players and professional players in other leagues are like they stand off a little bit because they don't want to get attacked and they're trying to protect their personal brand and that kind of thing. So it's created some distance between fans. Whereas with a lot of the women's sports, young girls and young fans can connect with these stars at a game, shake their hand, get an autograph.
Yeah.
And that means a lot to those fans.
Yeah, and going back to our original, our stadium piece, I mentioned it in the column I wrote, but, the intimacy of the old suburban stadiums being reused, and that's been a big winner for them as well.
So, Richard, I want to finish off with the closing five. Do you remember the first sports event you ever attended?
Well, outside of my little town of Warwick Nibbill, where I go and watch the Lions every Saturday, my Saturday afternoons. My parents were from New South Wales, so I hadn't been to a lot of sport in Melbourne, but we used to go up on holidays on the Central Coast, and we dropped in the 74-75 fifth test between Australia and England.
Yep.
And it was Test Australia retained the Ashes. Greg Chappell made 149 on the day I was there, and Doug Walters got a standing ovation for 18. It was the height of that great Australian side, and I'll never forget it, the SCG packed and heaving.
Yes, definitely. And you would have been to a few sports events in your time. Do you have a favourite food memory or a go-to food when you're at a sports event?
This is going to sound extremely arrogant, but at Augusta, at the golf there, the press are treated like royalty. I think it's to suppress all the bad memories the club has of the past, if anyone knows the true history of Augusta. Yep. But I remember the first time a golf writing friend of mine said, come up to the balcony, we'll go and have the clam chowder. And we sat on the balcony eating clam chowder, and Jack Nicklaus was on the next table, and I think Nick Faldo was two along, and you're looking over the beautiful Augusta golf course. That was fairly hard to beat.
No, it's not a bad memory at all. What's the first app you open in the morning?
I go to the English football apps. The world football apps usually, because I'm a quite a big football consumer. So the thing I cannot stay up for usually is the European football and
the 1
Cup,
o'clock.
And I must admit, if my tragic old QPR have played a Wednesday night game at Derby or something, I want to know how many we lost by. So for some reason I was just go through the English football results first on the various soccer apps.
Who is someone that you either follow or read potentially that you suggest the Sports Geek podcast listeners follow and check out?
I'm a big fan of the grade cricketer, I must admit, and I've had a bit to do with them. Sam Perry, one of the founders, did a turn at our club night, but I love how they've captured a little market. I really like people. I think it's one of the great things about social media online is those people who just feel a really great niche, and they've just captured the essence of what it's like actually playing the game, and that macho alpha culture of, it's kind of the worst and best of club cricket. So Grade Cricketer is a bit of a go-to of mine. Yeah,
so check out the Grade Cricketer on Twitter for all things there. And so lastly, what social media platform is your MVP?
Well, I guess I'm a bit of an old Twitter tragic. I know everyone's moved on to TikTok, and that's probably old hat now or something. I know I
haven't seen too many sports journals on TikTok. Would be. I'd like to see someone like Robbo or Bill Simmons or Woj on TikTok. That would be a turn up. Yeah. So no, I guess I still enjoy. As we mentioned previously, I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with it because I find you can. And you find yourself in a fight you didn't pick. But I still find it good for, I put out my columns twice a week that I write on the ABC site. And, it's just really good getting the instant response and occasionally getting the odd spelling mistake pointed out to you as well. Yeah. I mean, I think that's where it is. Like it is a good publishing platform and a way to have a conversation if you want. And it is about managing your time. But then also when there is a live experience, you can still get that experience of I'm watching this with everybody else, whether it's a big live news breaking event or a shared experience. Like the Aussies playing England at Lords or whatever, and everyone's on the same couch and we're all tweeting about the same thing. Yeah,
it's funny you say that. I think it was during the Ashes. I found myself, with phone in hand, looking at the screen, and I'm like, oh God, I'm concentrating. And then I looked it up, and there was a stat that I think 80% of people now watch TV or screen, whatever screen they're watching, with a second device. So I thought, I'm part of the majority. I felt a little bit relieved because I thought I'd lost my powers of concentration, but everyone has.
There is a bit of that. There is a bit of, they talk about the phone as the second screen. I'm like, I don't know. I think it might be the first screen. Like there's a little bit of, I'm looking for my, witty take or have my say or like, you know, and again, back to that, you know, you're a journalist building out your brand. Like if you have the right take at the right time about something, you're effectively, you know, the 5th, 6th, 1000th colour commentator on the coverage.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think my brand has been long ago built and probably under renovation and possibly condemned. But anyway, it's good to be part of the conversation still anyway.
Well, thank you very much for coming to the podcast. Where can people find you if they wanted to reach out, say hello, say they listen to the podcast? What's the best platform?
Yeah, probably, on Twitter at @RDHinds, HINDS. But, say good day.
Well, thank you very much, Richard. As I said, you can follow Richard on Twitter and keep up to date with his musings on the world of sports, business, grassroots, everything in that sort of space. As well, if you want to talk about cricketers and making runs slowly, you can also chat to Richard about that.
Anytime.
Thanks, mate.
We'd love your support on our Patreon campaign. Go to sportsgeekhq.com/Patreon.
Thanks again to Richard. Richard Hinds. You can connect with him and send him a tweet. RD Hinds. RDHINDS on Twitter. Or you can find all the links from this podcast and from every podcast by using the show number. This is show 270. So go to sportsgeekhq.com/270. But yes, please send Richard a tweet, especially if you're tweeting about cricket or you want to talk about grassroots sports. Please send him a tweet. Tell him that you listen to the podcast. Just a bit of an update on what I'm doing behind the scenes when I'm not podcasting. I have answered this actually recently on one of the Q&A episodes, but recently did a new digital team workshop with some new content at the start, a new keynote that I've titled Steer with Pride. Effectively, it goes through best trends of the internet, looking at some of the trends of where the audiences are moving and some of the trends on different platforms, as well as tapping into some of the trends from people like Mary Meeker and the like, as well as looking at some of the best practice in the world of sport. So it was a really good exercise and a really good workshop to sort of kick things off with that. And then we dive into a little bit of content design. How do you go about designing your content that your team wants to develop? But then also how to work on how your team both develops those content ideas, but then learns to pitch those content ideas, whether they're being pitched to just your boss, whether they're being pitched to sponsorship, whether they're being pitched to the CEO, because you have to get funding for some of these content initiatives. So really giving the digital team some skills on why they might do it, how they would go about pitching it, and how they can really tackle those really big ideas. So if you're interested in that kind of stuff, happy to talk to you about what a workshop might look like for your team. I'm also ready to have a chat and have a call with anyone who is a podcast listeners. I've made it pretty obvious for 2020. I want to work on big problems and help solve them and work on these big projects, these real game changers. So if you've got one of those on your desk that you haven't been able to tackle and you haven't had the bandwidth to do, let's see if we can help unlock that. If you want to book in for a time to have a chat, simply go to sportsgeekhq.com/phone call. And don't forget, please send in your questions for the Q&A episodes. I'm really enjoying doing those. I tackle 3 questions as quickly as I can in a short form. And it's much better if the questions are coming from you and I don't have to make them up. So go to sportsgeekhq.com/questions. I'm sort of trying to batch them all up together and knock them out. So I can get a month's Q&A episodes done in the one hit. So I'm accepting questions right now. So please send them in. And as always, if you're enjoying this podcast, if you're enjoying our podcast both on a Tuesday and a Friday and also Sports Geek News, I'd really appreciate it if you would support what we're doing with our Patreon campaign. Simply go to sportsgeekhq.com/Patreon. Until next episode, my name is Sean Callanan, and you've been listening to Sports Geek.
Join Sports Geek Nation access to exclusive Slack and Facebook groups with regular Q&A sessions with Sean Callanan. Go to sportsgeeknation.com to join. Got a question for Sean? Send it in for our Sports Geek Q&A series. Go to sportsgeekhq.com/questions. Go to sportsgeekhq.com for more sports digital marketing resources.